Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I just want to let you guys know we'll have one more lecture in here today on September 18th, and then we'll be back in our spot at the Orientation Center. So today's lunchbox lecture will be brought to you by Celeste Schexnayder. Just remember to silence your cell phone, and today's lecture will be featured on Facebook Live as all the others. Remember to go home and share it with your friends. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to turn it over to Celeste.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks to you viewers on Facebook Live. This presentation has been consuming for me. I've been so interested in the material, in the art, and I hope that you'll find that it inspires you in the same way that it's inspired me. A little bit about myself is that I'm an art therapist. And what an art therapist is a psychotherapist, a mental health therapist, often with mental health, although we work with in other arenas, and I'll go over some of that, but mainly through encouraging our clients to express themselves through art. So I'm working with people as they're creating art and encouraging them to use specific tools to evoke what they may not be able to say with words. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've looked at thousands of images. So some of what I intuit, I think, comes from looking at so much. And I'll do my best to convey that to all of you. But my training is that I have a master's in art therapy. I'm also a nationally certified counselor. And I've worked with trauma, specifically inpatient, for over 20 years, and now in my private practice. And I have worked with a lot of abuse victims, but as well I have worked with war veterans. And what we're doing today is going to be kind of a flip on it, because of course I didn't have the opportunity to meet Guy de Montlaur or his family. I know one of which, Delphine, his daughter, lives here. And I've really gotten most of my information from the art and what I'm able to find about his life online and in publications. So I'll begin with these two that I think are pretty good representations of his work, but you're going to see that it starts off differently and ends differently. So that these two pieces kind of are in the middle of a lot of the work he's done. And I wanted to mention the image on the left particularly because it starts in 1949. He begins to paint it shortly after the war, but he doesn't come back to it and finish until 1968. And a lot of life has occurred between then. And one of the things about art therapy, we use a lot of assessments, and something we use a lot of are trees. So that symbolically we look at the tree as an image of the self. And Carl Jung, who's a famous psychologist and symbologist, really referred to the tree as an individuation of the self's development. And when I look at these trees, I want you to notice that they look stark. There aren't any leaves, and it's an Indian summer, so we know that the intention is that we see some of the snow on the bark, that it had snowed, right? Indian summer is a warm day that comes after a killing frost or the first snow. And I think this is a really great example of what I see in him. There's a bleakness in the tree. We don't see where it's rooted everywhere. I also notice that there's, several different trees. Sometimes the number can mean something, like how many in a family, how many losses. You can see that correlate in art therapy a lot. And we also see the juxtaposition of bright, bold primary colors against the stark black. And we're going to see more of that as we move through the images. On the right is an example of more towards his later work, when his work becomes a little bit more consolidated again. So I'll move through, there's a lot of information, and I want to give you a little bit of a background on post-traumatic stress disorder and also art therapy before we really kind of dig into the images. Okay. So looking at what art therapy is, we use art media and the creative process. We really believe that everyone can do this. You don't have to be an artist to be or see an art therapist. Thank goodness I wouldn't have a very good career if that was the case, right? We practice in all sorts of settings. Our goal is to improve the client's functioning. So whatever they're coming in with, we're working to improve that level of functioning, whether it's a diagnosis of depression, an adjustment disorder, a grief issue, etc. Our therapists are trained in both art and therapy. That's what makes our training unique. So we're really trained to look at art and the symbolic language of art, along with the therapy of verbal, talking therapy. So we're using the whole process, and we're really grounding it in development. So I work with kids as well as adults. It's not just for children, although sometimes I'll get that question. And one of the things I'm also trained in is to pace someone's emotional needs, so that I don't want to have them create something that's going to unconsciously, a lot of information is going to come up before they're ready to see it. And I've had that happen before, where somebody creates a really angry image and says, I'm not angry. Or they create something that might suggest trauma, and they say, I don't have any trauma. I grew up in a good family. So we can kind of deny it, right? And art gives us a place to put things that we don't know how to say. So for Montlaur, the artist, and I break it down into the artist, the soldier, and the wounds. It's really interesting. So he's born into this aristocratic family, so he's definitely privileged to an extent, and he grows up around art. Early on in his life, though, his father is in World War I, and it's actually has been exposed to gas attacks, and he ends up dying in Montlaur's early life. And Montlaur is like, wants this revenge for the death of his father. So he's really still carrying this anger. He grows into a really gifted painter, and he's incredibly trained. He's gone to the Sorbonne. He's really interested in philosophy and poetry, and he carries poetry books with him onto the battlefield. His music is indispensable to him as he paints. We learn this about him. And apparently prior to his imagery that we're going to see today, his pre-war imagery is of horses. He was really, did some racing and horseback riding in his childhood, and landscapes. But of course the imagery really changes after the war. He does meet an American in his training at the Sorbonne, and he marries a woman who's an American, and they spend 2 years in the States after the war. Him working at the Art Student League of New York. So here the soldier, he's a very decorated soldier. He's awarded at the end of his career 7 medals, and in fact the highest honor, the Legion of Honor from the French government. He begins right at the war's start, before France is taken. He is starting his art career and then gets drafted, and he goes right into it. And from everything I've read, he becomes an incredibly dedicated soldier, that he doesn't stop. He's relentless and focused in and it sounds like in everything he does. He manages, after France is taken, to escape and go through Spain into Portugal, and then end up in England training with the English specialty forces of the commando group. And he actually meets some pretty well trained English soldiers, who then the French soldiers create this form of the French commandos, and that's part of where the La Cour Front, where he takes part in raids, and then he ends up going through and becoming part of this elite force. So the wounds, these are important because we're going to see them in the art. One thing that's really significant to me is early on in his combat, he has to knife an opponent to survive. And as I look at the art, I see these slash marks in the art that feel like knife marks to me, knife wounds. He's, in fact, evacuated from the front, and then he decides, after he's a little bit better from the pleurisy. He's like, no, I want to go back. I don't want to take my whole convalescence. I'm going back to the front. And we see this in a lot of combat soldiers. They feel better being with their group than they do being in the peace of the back of the war. He does experience the very last time he lands another, it's right after D-Day as they take Germany from the other side near the Netherlands on Sword Beach. He ends up having some shrapnel wounds to the face and the eye, and that shrapnel is not able to be removed from his eye. And he suffers headaches and sinuses and eye pain throughout the rest of his life. So these two self-portraits, one in 1939, one in 1969, what strikes me is the depth of the eyes. My friend that I've heard will one day be able to look at me and love me. So how powerful to be able to look back at his own wounds, that young man who's carried so much. And in art training, artists are trained often to do and to look at their faces in the mirror, and they do lots of self-portraits. So this being a common part of art training. So now I want to look at the evolution of PTSD. And what we know is that there have been references to combat trauma, to shell shock, all the different soldier's heart, traumatic neurosis that we've called it all these many years. It isn't until 1980 that we learn that the Psychiatric Association and the Diagnostic Manual defines what post-traumatic stress disorder is. Prior to that, we have no other real term. So what we're looking at is we know that it's appeared in ancient war. We see it in the language of Hippocrates, the Bible, even Shakespeare, these soldiers that come back shocked. So we have all these different names for it. And there's controversy over what it is. Is it that these soldiers had a wound to their head, a concussion, or is it psychological purely? And what we're seeing as they go through World War I is that there's all these psychiatric casualties. They have no physical wounds, but they have these mental, emotional wounds. And so post-Vietnam syndrome is used in the 1970s, but what's interesting about that is that we begin to say, well, Vietnam was a bad war. So bad war, bad outcome, that's why these soldiers are wounded or hurt or psychiatrically impaired. But as we go back and we look at World War II, that's there too. But there's something about our ability as a culture, when the World War II veterans come back, that we don't really give permission to, in our culture, in our society at this time, to say, what was it like? And what we see is that a lot of soldiers, they don't want to talk about it because they don't want to remember. They also don't know how to speak to people who have no reference point. You know, one of the quotes that I pulled up from one of the World War II veterans that was interviewed, and I have a bibliography at the end of this if any of you are interested in reading what I have, but he says, the horror and atrocities were unspeakable. Arms, legs, heads, and guts. I witnessed the leg of my best friend being blown off in front of me. I had to duck for it to miss me, and it could have been me that stepped on that mine. And this best friend doesn't survive. And these people come back from the war not speaking about it, not having a place to put it. No container is big enough for what they feel. There's also in the exhibit, and I don't have it here, and I recommend that you go, if you haven't gone down yet, to look at the video that's in the exhibit called Let There Be Light. It was a film done in 1946 by John Huston, who was the director. But this film is banned and suppressed until 1981 when the federal government says, okay, we can let it out. Because we didn't want civilians to see how harmed and damaged and hurt that these World War II veterans when they came back. It's really profound, so I suggested that you definitely take a look at that. It's on YouTube as well. So I have a really interesting 4-minute video that I think explains PTSD pretty profoundly. Okay. Is it gonna work? I think it is. All right, here we go.
Anytime a helicopter went over, that affected me very much because I saw some guys die in a helicopter. Well, actually 2 helicopter crashes in Vietnam.
The biggest trigger for me is smell.
They do have a lot of nightmares. They have to do with what happened out there, most of them.
I was in Arabic class, and I remember the teacher. Like, I remember him lecturing us, and I looked out the window, and all of a sudden I started seeing things that weren't there. I really thought my rapist was there. I really thought he was going to come in the window and get me.
Before going to Iraq, I really didn't understand what road rage was. I couldn't understand why people would get so angry, and I found myself really furious at people who would do things, not even necessarily cutting me off and being dangerous, but just stupid things.
Back in the days when I was going through what I call my Chernobyl period, I slept 1 or 2 hours every other day. And I never slept without a loaded gun and a survival knife near me.
A lady was coming towards me in a hurry, and she dove right into her purse. And the first thing I did instantly was, I need to protect my nieces. I started scooting behind the pillar, started moving away. And I instantly went reaching for my hip, realized, wait, I don't have a knife or a gun. And this happened in like 3 seconds, and all she did was in my head, all I was thinking was gun, 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 gun. She's gonna pull a gun on me. And all she did was get her cell phone.
Sometimes I really can't leave my house.
When I first came back, I couldn't even walk in Walmart. I had a real hard problem going to Walmart. I'd hear people talk from a different language, and it put me on edge. I would literally back up against the aisle in the wall and watch the aisle down until they passed, if they were behind me.
I used to disappear on weekends and just drive. Come home on Monday morning and go to work. They understand why I would do things like I would drive to New York City to get a cup of coffee at night and drive home. Driving became my release. They couldn't understand that at the time. They do now. They realize that I just had to do that.
The emotional numbness, I think, is the most. It'll just tear away all the relationships in your life.
I don't want to have to try and explain it to people. And I didn't want to have to go over my experiences every single time to try and let somebody know. So it's much easier just not to have friends.
Everything I did was wrong. The war in Vietnam was my fault. Anyone who died there, I might as well pull the trigger. It was my fault. So therefore, I probably wasn't worth helping.
I trusted no one, absolutely zero trust, even in my own family, my own sons, my immediate family. And friends that I had, lost total trust in my friends because I felt like if I trusted somebody and somewhat opened up, I was going to get hurt.
If you're going around saying everybody else has a problem and it's not me, chances are, yeah, you're the one with the problem.
So, pretty profound. I don't know if you guys noticed the intensity in the eyes of those soldiers that talked as they spoke. And hold on just a second, I gotta find my PowerPoint. Oh, it's down here.
As you go about the task of trying to understand narcissism, one of the things that begins to rise to the surface.
I wanted to say a little bit more about the PTSD, not everybody is going to get PTSD, and so that's really important for us to understand. During the war, they wanted to try to screen out people who they thought might get PTSD during the World War II, and what they learned was that that wasn't possible. We're not really sure why some people who are exposed to the same trauma are going to have PTSD follow them. There are some things that might make you susceptible, but at the same time, we're looking at symptomology, and so the treatment is usually about containing those symptoms. And just a few more things, they broke it down in the video really well. The symptoms break down into negative thoughts and feelings, avoidance of reminders, arousal and reactive symptoms. And it's also, to look at that people, when they come back from a trauma, they may have persistent memories. They may have those symptoms, especially right after. But what makes something more of a PTSD diagnosis, and it requires a psychiatrist or a mental health professional to diagnose, is to have those symptoms. And there's a whole list in the DSM-5 that allow you to see, well, they were exposed to mainly often a life-threatening event. Someone they loved died, even if they weren't there, they imagined it, or they witnessed it. And even first responders, and I think that's really important today, on September 11th, to recognize that even though if you're a first responder and you don't know any of the people that you're saving, image after image after image inundates the brain, the psyche, the heart. And that can create PTSD as well. So this is an interesting sort of thing, I think, about forward treatment. In World War I, they start to see all these psychiatric casualties, right? And they don't anticipate it. So they begin to think about, well, how do we deal with this? And psychiatrists become convinced that evacuating the soldiers to the back, because they start doing this and bringing them completely away, actually doesn't allow soldiers to come back. They end up not being able to return. And I think on some level, yeah, it was their goal to bring them back to the front. I mean, we need to acknowledge that we needed our soldiers. And what they found was that if they treated the soldiers in the front near the war din, so that the psychiatric casualty, or the person who's experiencing combat exhaustion, they can still hear it, but they're in the structure of the military, and that's very comforting because it's what they know. It's also that people get them. So if they send in fellow soldiers to talk to them, they seem to do better. If they send in that person or other professionals and say, you're gonna get through this, it's okay, it's gonna be okay, that helps them improve. So with this expectation of positivity, there's a higher likelihood that they will return, rather than if they're evacuated to the back to a peaceful environment. And even though we learned this in World War I, we don't utilize it in World War II until the middle of the war, or the middle of their effort in like 1943, where I think it was even after, famously, I think it was Patton who called somebody a yellow belly, or did some really ugly language towards some soldiers because they had combat fatigue. And Eisenhower, in fact, came in and said no. He was a lieutenant, I think, at the time, said, this is not okay. So they started to incorporate this forward treatment. So current treatment approaches are trauma-focused psychotherapies and medication. But I want to point out that trauma-focused means the treatment focuses on the memory of the event. Now, the other thing is that, believe it or not, right, a lot of people are drawn to the military because they have trauma, right? They have some kind of connection to it. And that's not true for everybody, but I've certainly, in my experience of working with Iraq War veterans and more recent war veterans, there's definitely a socioeconomic draw to, maybe lower income are attracted to the military. Some people who are looking for a family, a place to belong. So it's possible that they also have trauma already. Prolonged exposure therapy, where you're gradually helping people move through what their phobia is. Maybe it's hearing a helicopter. Maybe it's startling to their touch, the touch of people. There are a lot of symptoms that can come with PTSD. EMDR is a new therapy that uses a left and right brain signaling. You have to be specially trained in that. And the other thing that we're seeing a lot more of is the expressive therapy. So for me, my training as an art therapist, what I'm really doing with art therapy is helping people move into their emotional creative brain. It shares the part of the brain with the senses, right? So when we're traumatized, and we're going to get into this now in this next slide, this research by renowned trauma and expert neuroscientist Bessel van der Kolk. He's done amazing studies, and he's really been in the forefront of treating PTSD. What they're studying is that on the left side of the brain, the verbal language center shuts down. Trauma occurs. Have any of you ever had a nightmare where you screamed and nothing came out? Offline. So trauma is imprinted in the creative right brain, the emotional center of the brain, the sensory center. So all the talking we can do, we're not going to move as quickly or as effectively the trauma out. And I really feel like for Montlaur, what a gift it was that he had this talent of painting. It saved him. And I think he speaks about that. What we're doing with creative expression is we're allowing people to emotionally regulate, right? So with PTSD, you're reactive, so it gives you this, okay, let me go down. It gives a container for what we feel. Sometimes people are like, no, I feel so much, that would never contain what I feel. My anger is so big I will hurt someone, right? So there's this bigness to the feeling, and art says, no, I can hold it here. And it can be through painting, all different media. We use clay, drawing, crayons, collage, sculpture, anything that's about creating, we're there using it as art therapists. I think this is super important. Traumatized people feel chronically unsafe in their bodies. And so what happens for us with art therapy, we're doing. So we're actually correcting an experience. Often trauma happens to the physical body. And so with our therapy, even when we're in combat, we're in our bodies. So with our therapy, we take it and we place it outside the body. Then we can talk about it outside the body. And we can deny or accept what's being said. So the physical act of creating assists in correcting painful experiences. Where they once felt helpless to new memories, they have a mastery and a sense of empowerment. And so another thing that I do with people who have PTSD is not only do I use the art to express the pain, but I step away from that and then use art to nurture, to comfort, to contain, to recognize your wholeness. So we're balancing both of that. And here, I just want to mention before we move into looking at the artwork, that just that the art and creativity is healing. It's innately curative. So it's this idea that it's in the doing that we heal, and that as we create, we are releasing. Every image is a self-portrait. As we create, we're tapping into this unspoken place where the feelings are. We're able to use color, use line, form, shape, and move it out. And sometimes, I had a client yesterday who has PTSD, and she said she got really, really freaked out on her way home from our session last week. She was in it. She said she got home and she knew all she had to do was just do a piece of art. So she had to sort of siphon off some of that was left. And I said, well, next time, create as many as you need to until you don't need to. Right, so we use like paper like 18 by 24 or 18 by 12. It's not big, but it's also bigger than this, right? We need a bigger container than that. And in Montlaur's paintings, you're gonna see some of them are quite large. So art healing is, in essence, self-help art therapy. And this, I believe, is what Montlaur was really doing. And we'll see now as we move in. Such a beautiful quote, I think, by him that really expresses what about painting? It came to me as a means to say these important things you don't speak about. These things can't be said clearly. They are quite literally unspeakable. They become blurry and they eventually vanish when analyzed. They can only be expressed through illusion. And I went and I checked to make sure it wasn't illusion. It's illusion. And doesn't that describe what we're talking about with these World War II veterans? Not being able to speak about it, but in this passing or casual reference. And I know I have uncles who were in World War II, and my father says they rarely spoke about it. So the first piece, and I'm going to show you much of the artwork that's down on the second floor. I really hope you go down after you hear this and look at the whole thing in its order. It's fascinating to see it all together. But he moves through some different styles. And for the purpose of today's lecture, I'm going to explore the following aspects. So I'm going to look at form, movement, color, and style. Now, as art therapists, we have a lot of assessments that we offer clients. And you do them with a client. So there's a questionnaire as well as observation. We really don't like to say that we analyze or interpret because we want the artist or the client's input, but of course we don't have that here. So these are just food, this is food for thought. I am sure that all of you are going to see things that I haven't yet. And I've looked at this a lot. So be curious. The other thing I invite you to do is to imagine in some of these images, to be in the image, to embody, to live in, to step into it. Because that tells us a lot about how it feels to be him. This image is cool because it's of his wife, and it's a really great story. He really just admired his wife and spoke in such a loving way about how much she supported him. In fact, his youngest daughter who lives here, she had reported to one of the other curators here that her mother would see him beginning to kind of get unglued. And then they would call the family doctor, not a psychiatrist, just the family doctor. He would go see him and then he would be better for a while. So he had a place to sort of begin to put some of that, and then he would paint after. And then this stint would last, and then it would repeat itself. So looking at that, and this is his influence at the time, is Cubism. I think I mentioned earlier that he carried poetry with him. Apollinaire was one of them, and he was really considered in creative writing and poetry the leader of Cubism. And we see it's simple geometric planes and shapes and a locking, and it's quite contained. It's precise. It's whole. We're going to see this change. Here we see these two. They're done just a year apart. And it's interesting to me because they're both about bodies of water that he's looking at. The one on the right, though, is from a memory of the D-Day landing, Composition Beach. So they're different. And in the one on the right particularly, this is the one where I see sort of those slash marks, those black sort of knifing sort of slash marks that really feel like they're sharply dividing. And those are going to pervade as we move through his art, these strong black lines. Sometimes they're going to get bigger and sharper and more erratic. But still here, as we look at this, we more maybe like geometric cubism, we see this more contained. And any of you that are familiar with Wassily Kandinsky, he was a famous forerunner in Expressionism. He was one of Montlaur's favorite artists. So we see definitely his influence here in the art. But the color palette is going to really remain similar. It's going to have a lot of striking primary colors juxtaposed against the black and sometimes red. And I always feel like when I look at these, the flesh color really strikes me as flesh. So this painting refers to this landing where Montlaur, many of the people in his section are either killed or injured. And they've already come through Sword Beach on D-Day, and they need to take this bridge to open up their way into Paris, to take the capital back. And the Nazis have a stronghold here, and with Montlaur leading his unit, they seize it, and they rename it Pegasus. And this painting is a tribute to that. And we see this vibration that wasn't present before, this sort of breaking apart in the art. The color and the shapes are still there, but he begins to use a palette knife. And I also find that really interesting, right? That the knife becomes this, because if any of you paint, I mean, I love to paint. I rarely use a knife. Brushes feel very, very comfortable to me. They're soothing. A knife is a completely different way to create. And it's a very particular way to it's something to master. Not everybody's good at it. So we see this movement away from Cubism now, moving sort of a little bit more away from the geometric abstraction and more toward the expressionism. Wow, right? So the similarities in this imagery, you know, I hope that you can see, wow, we see these knife marks, you see those edges with the palette knife. The paint is really wet. We see transparency. There's an underpainting. But again, black boundaries are thicker. And the thing that I feel like it's just saying is, look at me. See this. Do you see this? I want to shout, just look at this mystery. It pierces the eyes and nobody sees it, nobody but me. People see color, shadows, lights, form. They see, but what do I know what they really see? The canvas, the structure nails, and I don't understand why they can't guess at all the distress here.
Sorry, I missed that.
Right in the middle, sorry, serious talking, right in the front of them, as it was during the war, the noise, death, love, betrayal, the lies and the fear, but still more that I cannot say. But I know how to do it. Yes, I say, I know how to do it. And for him, it was painting. So do you guys see the difference between these last two, right? What we see is this loose, really painterly, wet. It's the paint is loose and uncontained. It's in some sense messy, right? The feelings are messy. The yellow, I think, is so powerful here as it's set up next to the black. And again, these sharp primary colors of blue, red, yellow makes for a very powerful punch. And again, moving back to that statement here, noise, death, love, betrayal, lies, fear. So this image is made in memory of his aunt who dies in Ravensbrück concentration camp. Downstairs, when you see the exhibit, you'll see the watch that he wore. He acquired the watch. Such an interesting story because it's about PTSD and what we sometimes call a trauma bond. He acquires the wristwatch of the SS officer who's in charge of the concentration camp where his aunt died. 'N' died. 'N' And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he wears it the rest of his life. And he I mean, it gives me chills. Because many of us would go, ooh. But for him, it was about mastery and winning. And I think in this image, to me, the sadness, the forlornness, this really is the noise, death, love, betrayal, lies, fear that he speaks about. And part of me sees the shadow of a woman, the silhouette of a woman. And again, an illusion maybe, or illusion. So another tragedy occurs in his life. In 1966, he's a passenger in a car where they strike a young boy on a moped. He holds the young boy till he takes his last breath. This brings up just to the forefront, and any of you that are old enough to know what a Rolodex is, right? It spins, and with grief, images do that, so that a current grief or loss rolls us all the way back into these images of the past. And he becomes flooded with trauma from his war experiences. And to recognize that for those who are suffering with PTSD, this is what happens. They don't want the image. They want to get rid of the image, they want to stop. Nightmares are so common. Not just in people with PTSD, but very much for PTSD. They get flooded, and this is another place where imagery can help because it contains that. I once had a young boy in some of the work I did with this young child who had a mother who suicided. He didn't see it, but he drew his mother jumping off the Mississippi Bridge 25 times if he did it 100. I mean, it was amazing. He needed to release it, and he never saw it. And this one called Blood on the Pavement. Before the horror, this is like he who paints after having seen a friend. And so, really see the paint loosening even more. But there tends to be a little bit, I think, of blocking of color that's happening, but it's really open, right? It's like even compared to that fire painting where it's exploding, this is even more just like out there. And so these three paintings deeply evoke and relate the pain of his trauma and the re-traumatization that follows. So this is the third one called Midsummer Nightmare, again about the event. You see that those black containers, boundaries, follow the color. And I really feel like the white in here may be about the pavement, you know, and watching this young boy. I'd be interested to know what color the moped was and how that's represented here. So these images that follow bring up all of his fallen comrades. I've included two. There's actually a third one downstairs. I don't feel like I even need to really say anything about these. They're so strong, they're so painful. You know, looking at this one on the left about he is sleeping, remembering that friend, and perhaps thinking that that's maybe what he told himself to get through the death, was that he was sleeping. And here, remembering this very good friend who dies on the route to Salinels. And this one just feels, right? So if any of you have been struggling to imagine what it feels, I think that he's done it so well here that we recognize how witnessing death as human beings is so big for us to keep, and tragic death, and repetitive tragic death. And even, like if we go back to this one, as I was saying earlier, to imagine putting yourself in the image. If you imagine, you know, like making yourself really small and living in the center of this image, look out around it. It doesn't feel safe. I think they're amazing images. I think they're incredible. I love looking at them. And he's incredibly gifted. And at this point, he's really using the knife a lot. And we see a lot of transparency of colors. So you see how the green, there's an underpainting, and then there's paint on top. So we know that there's all these layers, right? Like layers of feelings. And you can see as you go, when you go downstairs how thick some of them are. And in the beginning, remember, they're real smooth, right? Now we see this texture on top of the painting. And for me, that feels visceral. The feelings are textured, they're not smooth. Especially in these, they're really rough and raw. And here, so this is what starts to sort of follow in the last 5 years of his life. Sadly, he only lived to be 58. But I hope what you notice is how it begins to smooth out. Now, there's still a lot of transparency, but the paint is using the knife and it's really flattening some of the color out, right? And we see that it's smooth and there's a lot of movement. So when we go back to that idea of form, movement, color, style, all the images have movement, right? But they're not, a lot of times, directed. This one is directed. So the movement is moving up. And it feels like, to me, off and out. And still the primary colors showing up here. But gray starts to show again, and that's not noticeable in all of it. It's almost like the black is beginning to soften into gray. And so some of his work from this point forward is called lyrical abstraction. That was kind of more of a movement in Paris at the time, but kind of indicating sort of the movement. It's not subjective. But it's really emotive. And in some ways they say sensuous would be a word that would describe lyrical abstraction. So this is another one done in 1972, a reference to June, early morning, and D-Day 1944. And again, look at the movement. It's not quiet, is it? You know? And again, if you put yourself in the image, how does it feel to be there? Another technique I like to use is something I call gestalting the image, and that's a technique where I ask the client to be the painting. So if I'm the painting, I say, I'm all over the place. I'm many colors. I'm smeared and blurry in some areas. I'm bright and sharp. I'm moving off and away. And so that can sometimes give us information. Sometimes that'll be homework that I give to clients when they work in their creative journals at home, to gestalt the image, because it tells us, you know, sometimes we don't want, it's easier for me to say what the painting feels than to say what I feel sometimes. And there's a little bit more orange in this, which feels more kind of like that fire, the explosions we imagine. The blue being perhaps the water from that day. So this is a painting he gives to his daughter, Elizabeth. She's, I believe, the eldest. First, one must have hope. It is a gift only given by God. Then one must have courage. That is not given by God, that is our own task. Finally, one must have strength. Real strength is given by God. And he's a really devoted Catholic. His faith is really important to him. In fact, there's a couple of paintings downstairs, one to Archangel Michael and Raphael. And there's a really interesting story, the one dedicated to Raphael, that's about his wife missing, getting bumped off a flight that actually goes down and is shot down by German aircraft, and she survives by that. She was getting on the plane, and I think a Reuters journalist bumps her, and he ends up dying. Everyone everyone on the plane dies, including, I think it was a famous actor, Leslie Howard. That was who it was. Again, movement. And I think this one sort of begins to separate the movement towards some more containing images. So this one, right, it feels like it's pouring, it's almost to me like a volcano moving up and out, draining down. And again, layers, sharp marks. It's heavy, right? And when you put it on, if you imagine it here on your chest, it's like, ugh, the heaviness of it. And so, you know, the way that I really view art after looking at so many in my career is to really allow myself to be with it, to be in it, and to witness it. And it's such a big part of the work I do, because we don't often take time to witness each other. We say we hear, but do we listen? Do we see? Do we really hold the space? And that's the difference, you're right, between compassion, which is, I'm so sad that you're sad, versus empathy, which is, I'm willing to go to that place with you. On the right, we have this much more contained. I love this image. I don't think this one is in the show, but what I like about it is the starting of seeing some of these pastel colors moving in. Lighter yellows, violet lavenders, and some more containment. This one feeling much more on the page than moving off the page. And finally, these are two images downstairs. They're quite large, larger than we see them here actually. And, you know, for me, this one on the left with the heavy heart, I really see images of buildings. And what strikes me is it's almost like a path that I see moving up, like a road. And sometimes we equate in art therapy quadrants, like that right upper quadrant of the image is sort of like the present, adulthood, and there's like this movement out and up, sort of indicating to me him moving into his life at this point. Really kind of having mastery in his art form. He's accomplished, he's had plenty of shows at this point, although he never reached the level of, I think, notoriety that he deserved, but he was considered a hero in France. And I mean, I think people all over France know who this man is. And on the right, we see, you know, the containment still, but there's actually, this is an image of a bird of paradise. So I don't know if you see, if any of you, I have a bush in my garden right now that's got a whole bunch of birds. They look like birds. They have little cockatoo sort of orange or yellow feathers that come up at the top of these flowers. And apparently he had a bush outside his window in his studio. And this is one of his final paintings. And what we see is still some of the palette knife with the transparency of color. Again, we find this containment happening. The form has become more consolidated than the beginning. And when you see the show up close, you're gonna see in the timeline just how it moves and changes. I think it's super exciting just to see it and have learned about this man. I wonder, we have about 5 minutes left if anybody has any questions. Anything they want to share that they see? Yes.
With a heavy heart, I feel like in the bottom, towards the right, maybe it's a person on all fours, and maybe his heart is laying him down.
Right, I agree with you. I couldn't figure, for me, I wondered if it was a horse. Yeah?
I see it's the three people from that wreck. I think it's the blue is Guy holding the child, and behind him is the driver.
Here, Paul?
So that's the child, and then the blue, the face, the blue and the yellow, you can see sort of the eyes and the nose. That would be him holding him, and be the figure in the back that's reddish and black. Maybe the person who's driving the car.
and such a tragic accident. I don't know that anyone was processed or arrested. And I think that it just brought forth so much. Yeah, this is probably one of my favorite paintings. I think you'll see downstairs. I have a whole bunch of them, but I want to just sort of, since we have a few minutes left.
How did he die? Did he take his own life, or was he ill?
He died of natural causes.
He was just so young.
I know, and I don't have, I don't know if anyone here who's from the museum has that information, but I tried to find it and I couldn't, and when I talked to one of the curators who works here, she said that it was natural causes. But I think sort of to go back and look at some of these that happen, you know, and sort of to go through and see the, you know, look how they change, right? Tight.
But then you notice from the beginning when he's like in that like cubism stage, and at the end it kind of that, and then it kind of gets all over the place, and then at the end it's
right
squaring back up again.
Exactly. And for me, it's like he's really tight here, and then in the process of moving through it, he unravels some. I mean, I'm guessing, hypothesizing, but I see this unraveling, this loosening, this falling apart, even though I wouldn't describe the art as untalented or falling apart. That's what I see in the image. And then this cohesion returns in the form, right? And I agree with you, at the very end, he goes back, right? So we're loosening, the lines are curved, they're not as geometric. Here they're vibrating, it's like so nervous, this image to me.
It's like chaos.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, imagine this is before landing. How anxious would you be? You know you're getting ready to go in and take this major, and he's leading it, take over this major stronghold. The explosion, the movement, the knife, you see on the right, just all that, the texture, see how the paint is, we see the edges of the paint knifed on. And the image is there of the sky, explosion. You know, I really feel like if we could talk to him now, it would be like, what was yellow for you? Well, you know, the blue, I think he indicated somewhere that was the sky. And he said the red was like the sharpness of the feeling and the distress. And he liked to put that distress right up next to the clear blue sky. And I think that's sort of what that Indian summer painting is about too. The irony, right, of like the cold and the warmth of an Indian summer. So really loose here, right? No form, geometric form. It's completely lost. It's all emotive and expressive. Certainly painful. And with lots and lots of texture, and it's rough. And if anybody wants me to spend more time on one, let me know. Yeah.
So, I think, I don't know, I've never heard of this artist, by the way.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. So, like, what I find in my practice when I get an artist, they want to concentrate on making the art, as opposed to the beauty of art therapy is the properties of the media and how the emotions start to evolve. So, perhaps
it is
starting
evolving.
to realize like how this is actually moving my emotions.
Yeah.
But it's hard to guess all this when they're not here.
Right. So just kind of, again, we'll just kind of slip through. I know we have to go offline just a moment. But you see it changing even from that last picture? Yeah.
I wanted to share with you that my father was on Midway when it was invaded at the beginning of the war, and then later the Battle of Midway. While he was on Midway, between the Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway, which was in May, 5 months later, on Midway Island with nothing to do. And so he painted.
Oh,
and he painted the birds of Midway. They paint them with colored pencils.
That's fantastic.
And he's got a album of about 30 pictures of the birds of Midway. When he came back, after having served on the father's staff at the end of the war, he came back. He painted 4 surrealist pictures. One of them, all of them just expressing angst and
Right.
anxiety.
And I think
Totally different approach
Right.
after the war.
Thank you for reminding me, because the truth is that I do think, and Dauphine, one of their daughters talks about it, she says that she feels like her father purposely picked this abstraction because he didn't have to explain it. And he could just feel it and put it out there. And I would love to talk to you more about your dad. That's so fascinating.
I'll bring you pictures.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, and I'm just going to end on my bibliography. If anybody would like a copy of it, let me know. I know we're just out of time. So thank you guys so much for being here. And,